The fluorescent light of the prestigious law firm cast harsh shadows across the marble floors as Sarah Martinez pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway. It was 2:47 a.m., and the silence was broken only by the soft squeak of her cart's wheels and the distant hum of the air conditioning system. Her hands, raw from the industrial cleaning chemicals, gripped the handle tightly as she tried to ignore the gnawing pain in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, saving every dollar for something far more important than her own comfort. Her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, lay in their small apartment, fighting a condition that required surgery costing more than Sarah made in an entire year. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her nights cleaning the offices of lawyers who made more in a day than she did in months. Yet she couldn't afford to save her own child's life. David Chun adjusted his Italian leather chair and glanced at his Rolex as he reviewed the quarterly profit reports. The numbers were impressive, even by his standards. Chun and Associates had increased their profit margins by 12% this quarter alone, largely due to what he called operational efficiency. What he didn't call it was paying the cleaning staff, security guards, and administrative assistants' wages that barely covered rent in the city. At 42, David had built his reputation on being ruthless in business and generous in charity galas, a combination that had earned him respect among the city's elite. His corner office overlooked the financial district, where millions of dollars changed hands daily, yet he'd never considered how his own employees survived on the wages he approved. The disconnect between his world and theirs was as vast as the view from his 42nd floor window, and he preferred it that way. Sarah's shift ended at 6 a.m., but her day was far from over. While other people were just starting their morning routines, she was preparing for her second job, one that filled her with both desperation and shame. In a small corner of their cramped kitchen, she had already prepared dozens of tamales, working by the light of her phone to avoid waking Emma. The smell of masa and seasoned pork filled their tiny apartment, a comforting aroma that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in better times. But these weren't being made for family gatherings or celebrations. These were her lifeline, each tamale representing a few more dollars toward Emma's surgery fund. She carefully wrapped each one in corn husks, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, each motion heavy with a weight of necessity. The street corner of 5th and Madison wasn't chosen for its charm or convenience. Sarah had scouted dozens of locations before settling on this spot, where the morning rush of office workers intersected with her desperate need for customers. She arrived at 6:30 a.m. with her small cart, a battered cooler, and a hand-painted sign that simply read homemade tamales $3 each. The early morning air was crisp, and her breath formed small clouds as she set up her modest operation. Other vendors gave her suspicious looks, protective of their territory, but Sarah kept her head down and focused on her goal. She wasn't there to compete or build a business empire. She was there to save her daughter's life, one tamale at a time. The first customers were construction workers heading to job sites, hungry men who appreciated authentic food and didn't ask questions about permits or licenses. Emma's medical condition had been diagnosed 6 months earlier, when what Sarah thought was a persistent cough turned into emergency room visits and specialist consultations that drained their savings account. The doctors explained the surgery in terms that sounded both urgent and expensive, using words like critical and time-sensitive that sent ice through Sarah's veins. Insurance would cover part of the cost, but the remaining $15,000 might as well have been $15 million. Sarah had applied for loans, reached out to charities, and even swallowed her pride to ask family members who had their own struggles. Each rejection was like a physical blow, but it only strengthened her resolve. She would not let her daughter suffer because of money. She would not let the system's failures become Emma's sentence. If selling tamales on street corners was what it took, she would sell tamales on street corners. The morning routine became a carefully choreographed dance of survival. After selling her tamales to early commuters, Sarah would rush home to get Emma ready for school, then catch a few hours of sleep before the afternoon brought new challenges. Emma, wise beyond her 8 years, had learned not to ask too many questions about why Mommy was always tired or why they ate pasta for dinner 5 nights a week. She helped by being good. By not complaining about the generic brand cereals or the secondhand clothes. By pretending not to notice when her mother counted and recounted the bills each month. The weight of trying to shield her daughter from their reality pressed down on Sarah's shoulders like a physical force. But Emma's trust and love gave her strength. Every time her daughter smiled or hugged her goodnight, Sarah knew she would do whatever it took to protect that innocence. David's discovery of Sarah's street vending happened by accident during one of his rare early morning arrivals at the office. His driver had taken a different route due to construction, and they stopped at a red light directly in front of Sarah's corner. Through the tinted windows of his BMW, David watched as his night cleaner, he recognized her, despite never having learned her name, served tamales to a small line of customers. His first reaction wasn't concern or curiosity, but irritation. Employees of Chun and Associates were expected to maintain the firm's reputation, and having his cleaning staff running unauthorized food operations on public streets could be seen as a liability issue. He made a mental note to address this with building management, viewing it as just another operational problem to be solved efficiently and quietly. But something about the scene nagged at David throughout the morning. During his usual review of staffing reports, he found Sarah's file and was surprised to learn she had been with the company for 3 years with perfect attendance and no complaints from building management. Her supervisor's notes described her as thorough, reliable, and respectful. She worked 40 hours a week at minimum wage, which David had always assumed was appropriate for cleaning services. The math was simple. Market rate for her position, multiplied by hours worked, equaled her paycheck. What he had never calculated was whether that paycheck could actually sustain a person's life in their expensive city. The numbers on his reports represented profit margins and operational costs, not human beings with rent payments, medical bills, and children who needed food and clothing. Sarah's interactions with law enforcement became a constant source of anxiety that made her hands shake and her stomach twist in knots. City inspectors seemed to appear from nowhere, demanding permits she couldn't afford and threatening fines that would devastate her. Tamale Fund, she learned to pack up quickly when she spotted their uniforms, moving her cart to different locations like a chess game played against opponents with all the advantages. The permits alone would cost more than she made in 2 weeks of tamale sales, creating an impossible cycle where following the rules meant giving up on saving Emma's life. Police officers varied in their approach. Some ignored her completely, others asked her to move along with tired resignation, and a few seemed to take personal offense at her presence on their streets. Each encounter was a reminder of how precarious her situation really was, how easily her small attempt at survival could be crushed by bureaucracy and regulation. The judgment from passersby was perhaps worse than the official harassment, because it was constant and unpredictable. Well-dressed office workers would sometimes stop to buy tamales, praising the authentic flavors and asking about our recipes with genuine interest. But others would wrinkle their noses, make comments about these people taking over the neighborhood, or lecture her about proper channels and legal procedures. Sarah learned to read faces quickly, to identify potential customers versus potential problems, to smile and stay quiet when confronted with prejudice disguised as concern. She developed a thick skin out of necessity, but each cruel comment still cut deep, especially when Emma was mentioned. "What kind of mother sells food on street corners?" one woman had asked loud enough for others to hear, and Sarah had to grip her cart handle until her knuckles turned white to keep from responding. The physical toll of working 2 jobs began showing in ways Sarah couldn't hide anymore. Her hands, already damaged from cleaning chemicals, now bore cuts and burns from food preparation. Dark circles under her eyes deepened week by week, and she lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her back ached constantly from bending over cleaning supplies all night and standing on concrete all morning. Emma started asking why Mommy's hands looked so red and rough, why she sometimes fell asleep while helping with homework, why she seemed to be getting smaller instead of bigger, like other adults. Sarah would deflect these questions with jokes or distractions, but privately she worried about how long her body could sustain this pace. The irony was bitter. She was slowly destroying her health to save her daughter's life, hoping she could hold out long enough for one goal without completely sacrificing the other. David's morning routine of reviewing security footage was meant to check for any overnight incidents that might affect the firm's operations. What he saw instead was footage of Sarah working through the night with methodical precision, cleaning every surface with care that went beyond job requirements. She straightened books on shelves, carefully arranged items on desks, and even cleaned windows that weren't part of her assigned duties. This wasn't the work of someone cutting corners or doing the minimum required. This was the work of someone who took pride in their job despite being paid wages that barely acknowledged their humanity. The disconnect between her dedication and her compensation began to trouble David in ways he hadn't expected. He found himself watching more footage, seeing how she worked alone through long nights while he slept in his comfortable suburban home, how she maintained standards that exceeded expectations while struggling to survive on what he paid her. The turning point came on a Thursday night that started like any other but ended with a confrontation that would change everything. Sarah had finished her cleaning shift and was setting up her tamale cart when a group of college students, clearly intoxicated and looking for entertainment, noticed her small operation. Their expensive clothes and confident swagger marked them as the children of privilege. Young people who had never worried about medical bills or rent payments, who saw the world as their playground and other people as characters in their personal stories. They approached Sarah's cart with a kind of aggressive friendliness that comes from too much alcohol and too little consequences. Their voices loud and their movements exaggerated as they performed for each other rather than genuinely engaging with her as a person. "Look at this authentic cultural experience," one of them announced loudly, his words slurred with alcohol and condescension. Sarah kept her head down and continued serving tamales to other customers, hoping the group would lose interest and move on to whatever other entertainment the night might offer them. But they seemed determined to make her part of their show, pointing out her cart to other passersby, taking photos without permission, and making comments about real street food that carried undertones of mockery disguised as appreciation. Sarah's hands began to tremble as she handled the money from legitimate customers, her anxiety rising as the situation escalated beyond her control. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but this felt different, more threatening, more humiliating, more dangerous to the careful dignity she had tried to maintain despite her circumstances. The situation deteriorated rapidly when one of the students decided that buying tamales wasn't enough entertainment for his group. "Hey, you look tired," he called out to Sarah, his voice carrying the false concern of someone who had never experienced real hardship. "Here, let me help you out." He began pulling crumpled dollar bills and loose change from his pockets, throwing them at Sarah's feet while his friends laughed and encouraged him with drunken cheers. "There you go, charity case," he announced proudly, as if he was performing some great act of generosity rather than inflicting a calculated humiliation. The coins bounced off the pavement around Sarah's cart, creating a metallic sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Other pedestrians began to stop and stare, some with concern, others with curiosity, all of them witnessing Sarah's degradation as public entertainment. Sarah's face burned with shame and anger as she looked down at the scattered money around her feet. Every instinct told her to walk away, to pack up her cart and preserve what remained of her dignity. But Emma's face appeared in her mind, and her feet stayed planted firmly on the concrete. She needed every dollar these cruel strangers had thrown at her, even if picking it up meant swallowing more humiliation than she had ever experienced in her life. Her hands shook as she knelt to collect the coins, trying to ignore the laughter and comments from the group of students, trying to focus on Emma's surgery fund rather than the burning shame that filled her chest. This was the price of trying to save her daughter's life, kneeling on cold pavement, gathering money thrown at her like she was some kind of performing animal, enduring the worst kind of human cruelty disguised as charity. David had worked late that night, unusual for him but necessary due to an important case deadline. He was walking to his car when he witnessed a scene unfolding on the corner. His employee, the woman whose name he had finally learned from her file, being humiliated by a group of young people who clearly had no understanding of real hardship or genuine need. What he saw wasn't just cruelty directed at a random stranger, but the direct result of his own business practices, his own decisions about wages and employee benefits, his own willful blindness to the reality of how his workers survived. The students were terrible, but David realized with growing horror that he was complicit in creating the desperation that had put Sarah in this position. His competitive wages and operational efficiency had forced a dedicated employee into a situation where she had to endure public humiliation just to afford her child's medical care. The moments stretched like an eternity as David watched Sarah collect the scattered coins while the students continued their performance of charity and superiority. He saw the careful control in her movements, the way she kept her face neutral despite the obvious pain and anger, the dignity she maintained even while kneeling on dirty pavement. This wasn't just an employee facing a difficult situation. This was a human being he had failed through his indifference to the real cost of living versus the wages he approved. The scene crystallized everything wrong with his approach to business, showing him the human cost of treating people as line items in budget reports rather than individuals with real needs, real struggles, real families depending on them. The distance between his corner office and the street corner where Sarah knelt seemed to represent everything wrong with his understanding of leadership and responsibility. Something fundamental shifted inside David as he witnessed the degradation of someone who worked for him, someone whose dedication he had seen on security footage, someone whose situation he could have improved with a simple decision about wages and benefits. The students eventually lost interest and moved on to other entertainment, leaving Sarah to finish collecting the scattered money and continue her quiet struggle for survival. David stood in the shadows, wrestling with realizations about his own complicity that made him feel sick to his stomach. He had built his career on being decisive, on taking action when situations required immediate attention, but he had somehow never applied that same urgency to the well-being of the people who made his success possible. The scene he had witnessed wasn't just random cruelty. It was the predictable result of systems and decisions he had created and maintained. The next morning, David couldn't concentrate on his usual review of cases and client meetings. The image of Sarah kneeling to collect coins kept interrupting his thoughts, making it impossible to focus on profit margins and billing hours. He found himself researching cost of living expenses in their city, calculating how much money a single parent would need for basic necessities, factoring in healthcare costs and emergency expenses. The numbers were sobering. Sarah's full-time wages, even with perfect attendance and no missed days, fell far short of what economists considered a living wage for their metropolitan area. She wasn't being irresponsible or making poor financial choices. She was trapped in a system where full-time work didn't provide enough money to handle basic emergencies, where dedicated employees were forced into humiliating second jobs just to survive unexpected medical costs. David's investigation into employee wages revealed a pattern that made him increasingly uncomfortable with his own role in perpetuating systemic problems. The cleaning staff, security guards, administrative assistants, and other support personnel all earned wages that looked reasonable in budget meetings, but were completely inadequate for actual survival in their expensive city. These weren't temporary employees or part-time workers. These were people who had been with the company for years, who showed up reliably, who took pride in their work, who deserved better than being forced into desperate side hustles to afford basic necessities. The competitive wages he had always approved were competitive only in the sense that they matched what other companies paid for similar positions, creating a race to the bottom that benefited employers while trapping employees in cycles of working poverty that no amount of dedication could break. Sarah continued her double life, unaware that her boss had witnessed her humiliation or was questioning the systems that had created her desperate situation. The morning after the incident with the college students, she woke up with bruised knees and a heavy heart, but also with $43 in crumpled bills and loose change that brought her closer to Emma's surgery fund. She had learned long ago to separate her emotions from her survival, to focus on practical progress rather than dwelling on the injustices she couldn't control. Emma was having a good day, laughing at cartoons while eating breakfast, oblivious to the price her mother had paid for their rent money. Sarah watched her daughter's innocent joy and felt renewed determination to continue whatever it took to save her life, even if it meant enduring more nights like the one she had just survived. The next few weeks brought a strange tension to David's daily routine as he found himself paying attention to details he had previously ignored. He noticed the tired faces of night shift workers leaving as he arrived each morning, the careful way cleaning staff moved through the offices, the quiet professionalism of people who were struggling financially but maintained dignity and work quality despite inadequate compensation. He began reading about wage inequality, employee well-being, and corporate responsibility, topics that had never interested him when his focus was purely on profit maximization and competitive advantage. The research opened his eyes to a broader conversation about business ethics and social responsibility that went far beyond charity donations and community service projects. Sarah's situation grew more precarious as city regulations tightened around unlicensed street vendors, making her morning tamale sales increasingly risky and stressful. She had to move locations frequently, sometimes losing entire mornings of income when inspectors appeared unexpectedly or police officers decided to enforce regulations more strictly. The constant anxiety of avoiding authorities while trying to earn money added another layer of exhaustion to her already overwhelming schedule. Emma's medical appointments provided regular reminders of the urgency of their situation. The doctors spoke in terms of optimal timing for surgery, windows of opportunity that wouldn't remain open indefinitely, medical realities that made Sarah's street corner struggles feel even more desperate and necessary. The breakthrough came during a routine building management meeting where David learned about the upcoming renewal of service contracts, including cleaning services. The current company's bid was competitive, meaning they would continue paying poverty wages to people like Sarah, while the law firm saved money on operational expenses. David sat in the conference room, surrounded by colleagues discussing cost savings and budget optimization, and realized he had the power to change Sarah's situation and the situations of dozens of other employees with a simple decision about contract terms and wage requirements. The amount of money involved was insignificant compared to the firm's overall budget, but it would be transformative for the people who actually did the work. For the first time in his career, David began to understand the difference between being powerful and using power responsibly. That evening, David made an unusual decision to stay late at the office, not to work on cases, but to encounter Sarah during her cleaning shift. He had never actually spoken to her despite seeing her file and witnessing her street corner struggles, and he realized that part of his detachment from employee realities came from his lack of personal connection with the people who made his professional life possible. When Sarah arrived for her shift, David was waiting in the main lobby, a sight so unusual that she immediately assumed she had done something wrong. Her face showed the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to being powerless in interactions with authority figures, someone who had learned to prepare for bad news and hope for the best while expecting the worst. "Mrs. Martinez," David said, his voice gentler than Sarah had expected from someone who lived in corner offices and expensive suits. "I'm David Chun, the managing partner. I wondered if we could talk for a few minutes before you start." "Yep." Sarah's hands gripped her cleaning supplies a little tighter, her mind racing through possible violations or complaints that might have reached the boss's attention. She nodded carefully, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. The lobby felt enormous around them, marble floors and expensive furniture, creating a setting that emphasized the distance between their positions in the company hierarchy. David gestured toward a seating area, trying to create a more comfortable atmosphere for a conversation that he knew would be difficult and potentially like. "I want to talk to you about your tamale business," David said, watching as Sarah's face went pale and her shoulders tensed for what she clearly expected to be disciplinary action. "I'm not here to create problems for you or question your choices. I'm here because I realize something about our wage structure that needs to change immediately." Sarah listened with growing confusion as David explained what he had witnessed on the street corner, how he had researched living wages in their city, how he had discovered that full-time employees at his company were being forced into second jobs just to survive basic emergencies. She had expected punishment or termination, not acknowledgement of systemic problems or discussions about wage inequality. The conversation felt surreal, like stepping into an alternate reality where bosses cared about employee well-being rather than just productivity and profit margins. David's explanation of his planned changes sounded too good to be true, making Sarah cautious about believing what she was hearing. He talked about immediate wage increases for all support staff, bringing everyone's compensation up to actual living wage standards for their metropolitan area. He discussed creating an emergency fund for employees facing medical crises, educational expenses, or other unexpected financial hardships. He outlined benefit improvements that would provide real security rather than minimal coverage, healthcare options that wouldn't bankrupt families dealing with serious medical conditions. Sarah listened with the skepticism of someone who had learned that hope could be dangerous, that counting on promises from powerful people often led to disappointment and continued struggle. But David wasn't just talking about future changes. He was offering immediate help for Emma's surgery. The company's new employee emergency fund would provide the remaining $15,000 Sarah needed, with no requirement for repayment, no strings attached, no questions about how the money would be used. Sarah's careful composure finally cracked as she realized that Emma's surgery could happen, that a daughter wouldn't have to wait for a mother to sell enough tamales or endure more humiliation from cruel strangers. Tears rolled down her cheeks as months of accumulated stress and fear began to release, as the weight of impossible choices lifted from her shoulders for the first time since Emma's diagnosis. The relief was so overwhelming that she couldn't speak, could only nod, as David explained the practical details of accessing the fund and scheduling the necessary medical procedures. The transformation at Chun & Associates began immediately, starting with emergency wage adjustments that brought all employees up to living wage standards. David discovered that the cost of treating employees fairly was much lower than he had assumed. The amount of money that would transform dozens of lives was less than what the firm spent on client entertainment in a single quarter. Other partners initially questioned the expense, but David's research and moral arguments gradually convinced them that employee well-being was not just ethically important but also good business practice. Turnover decreased, work quality improved, and the firm's reputation in the legal community was enhanced by their progressive approach to employee compensation and benefits. What had started as one woman's desperate struggle had become a catalyst for systemic change that affected every working person in their organization. Emma's surgery was scheduled for the following month, performed by specialists who had previously been financially out of reach but were now accessible, thanks to the company's emergency fund. Sarah sat in the hospital waiting room, no longer the exhausted woman who sold tamales at dawn to afford her daughter's medical care, but still the same loving mother who would do anything to protect her child. The surgery was successful, and Emma's recovery proceeded exactly as the doctors had hoped. For the first time in months, Sarah slept through the night without worrying about medical bills, inspection officers, or cruel strangers. She woke up to find Emma reading a book in the hospital bed, healthy and happy and completely unaware of the tremendous struggle her mother had endured to make this moment possible. David's understanding of leadership evolved dramatically through this experience, moving from a focus on operational efficiency and profit maximization to a more complex understanding of corporate responsibility and human dignity. He realized that true leadership meant ensuring that people who contributed to the company's success could actually benefit from that success, that treating employees fairly wasn't charity but basic justice. The changes at Chun & Associates became a model for other firms in their industry, demonstrating that competitive business practices and ethical employee treatment weren't mutually exclusive goals. David began speaking at industry conferences about wage equity and corporate responsibility, using his platform to encourage other business leaders to examine their own practices and consider the human cost of operational decisions. Sarah returned to work after Emma's recovery with a fundamentally different relationship to her job and her employer. She was no longer just a night cleaner trying to survive on inadequate wages, but a valued employee whose contributions were recognized and fairly compensated. The emergency fund remained available for future needs. But more importantly, her regular wages were now sufficient to cover normal expenses without requiring desperate side hustles or humiliating second jobs. She continued working the night shift, but now by choice rather than necessity, finding satisfaction in work that was properly valued and adequately compensated. Her hands healed from the damage of cleaning chemicals and food preparation, and her sleep schedule stabilized now that she no longer needed to sell tamales at dawn to afford basic necessities. The street corner, where Sarah had endured so much humiliation, became just another intersection in the city, no longer a stage for her desperate performance of survival. She sometimes walked past it on weekends with Emma, remembering the difficult months when that corner represented hope and shame in equal measure. Emma, now healthy and thriving, remained unaware of the full extent of her mother's struggle. But she noticed the positive changes in their life: better food, fewer worries, a mother who smiled more often and seemed less tired all the time. The experience had taught Sarah important lessons about dignity, perseverance, and the unpredictable ways that life could change through the intersection of personal determination and institutional responsibility. The broader impact of David's transformation rippled through the legal community and beyond. As other firms began questioning their own wage structures and employee policies, the success of Chun & Associates' employee-centered approach demonstrated that treating workers fairly enhanced rather than diminished competitive advantage, attracting better employees, reducing turnover costs, and improving overall productivity. David's reputation evolved from that of a ruthlessly efficient manager to a visionary leader who understood the connection between employee well-being and business success. The case studies and articles written about their transformation became required reading in business schools, inspiring a new generation of leaders to consider the full human cost of their operational decisions. Emma's full recovery and return to normal childhood activities marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in Sarah's life. The surgery had been completely successful, eliminating the medical condition that had created their financial crisis and restoring Emma's health to normal levels. Sarah found herself able to focus on other aspects of their lives: Emma's education, their living situation, her own career development within the company. The emergency fund remained available, but Sarah hoped never to need it again. Having learned the importance of financial stability and the devastating impact of medical crises on working families, she began contributing to a college savings account for Emma, planning for a future that looked radically different from the desperate struggle they had endured together. David's personal growth through this experience extended beyond professional realizations to fundamental changes in his worldview and values. He began volunteering with organizations that supported working families facing medical crises, using his legal expertise and financial resources to help other people navigate situations similar to Sarah. His perspective on wealth and success shifted from personal accumulation to social responsibility, understanding that true achievement meant creating systems that allowed everyone to thrive, rather than just maximizing individual profit. The transformation wasn't just about wage policies or corporate benefits, but about recognizing the humanity and dignity of every person who contributed to collective success, regardless of their position in organizational hierarchies. The Employee Emergency Fund that had saved Emma's life became a permanent fixture at Chun & Associates, helping dozens of other families navigate medical emergencies, educational expenses, and unexpected financial hardships. David established clear guidelines and adequate funding to ensure the program's sustainability. But more importantly, he created a culture where asking for help was seen as reasonable rather than shameful. The fund's success inspired similar programs at other companies, creating a network of support that extended far beyond the legal industry. Sarah's story became the foundation for a broader movement toward corporate responsibility and employee dignity that influenced business practices throughout their city and beyond. Years later, Emma graduated at the top of her high school class and earned a full scholarship to study medicine. Inspired by the doctors who had saved her life and the struggle her mother had endured to make her recovery possible, Sarah attended the graduation ceremony with pride that went beyond typical parental satisfaction, knowing that Emma's achievements were built on a foundation of sacrifice, determination, and the eventual intervention of institutional change. David was also in attendance. Having maintained a supportive relationship with Sarah's family throughout Emma's educational journey, the ceremony represented not just one young woman's academic success, but the long-term impact of treating working families with dignity and providing the support necessary for everyone to reach their potential. The transformation that began with Sarah's desperate tamale sales had created lasting change that extended far beyond one family's medical crisis. David's company became known throughout the legal industry for its progressive employee policies and commitment to social responsibility, attracting top talent and high-profile clients who valued ethical business practices. Sarah advanced within the company to a supervisory role, using her experience and perspective to help newer employees navigate their own challenges and access available resources. The street corner that had once been the site of her humiliation became irrelevant to her story, replaced by opportunities for dignity, growth, and contribution that reflected her true capabilities and worth. The final measure of their success wasn't found in profit reports or academic achievements, but in the simple fact that Emma grew up understanding the value of hard work, the importance of treating all people with dignity, and the responsibility that comes with success and privilege. Sarah had not only saved her daughter's life, but had helped create systems that would protect other families from facing similar, desperate choices. David had learned that true leadership meant using power to elevate others rather than simply maximizing personal advantage. Their story became a testament to the transformative potential of recognizing shared humanity across economic and social divides, proving that individual struggles could become catalysts for institutional change that benefited entire communities. The legacy of Sarah's courage and David's transformation continued to influence business practices and social policies long after Emma's surgery and recovery. Other companies adopted similar employee support programs, creating a broader movement toward corporate responsibility and worker dignity that changed how businesses understood their obligations to the people who made their success possible. The street corner where Sarah had once knelt to collect scattered coins became a symbol not of humiliation and desperation, but of resilience, dignity, and the potential for individual stories to create systemic change. Her tamales, once symbols of desperate survival, became memories of a difficult time that had ultimately led to better lives for countless families facing similar struggles.